Hey guys, tonight we delve into something so ubiquitous, so mundane. You've probably touched it a dozen times today without a second thought. We're talking paper, but its journey from a closely guarded secret in ancient China to the flimsy stuff your printer occasionally eats is a surprisingly epic, almost sloth-like adventure. Imagine trying to send a text message, but instead of a sleek phone, you have a bundle of bamboo strips weighing more than your cat. Yeah, you probably wouldn't survive that level of inconvenience for long. Your thumbs would revolt. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know down in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your corner of the world. I always find it fascinating to see our global community. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing in a dimly lit Han Dynasty scriptorium, the air thick with the scent of aging bamboo and the faint, almost metallic tang of ink. Around you, scholars, bent over low tables, are not scrolling through feather-light documents but wrestling with substantial burdens. Your gaze falls upon one, his brow furrowed in concentration as he etches characters onto a narrow strip of bamboo with a sharp stylus. Once he's done with that single column of text, he'll take another strip, and another, eventually binding them together with hemp cords to form a book. Imagine carrying your favorite trilogy around in that format. Your personal library would also be your personal gym. A single imperial decree, a philosophical treatise, or a collection of poems could easily fill an entire cart. A cumbersome library on wheels trundling slowly through the dusty roads of ancient China? It wasn't just bamboo. For more luxurious or important writings, there was silk. Picture the shimmer of a fine silk scroll, unrolling to reveal elegant calligraphy. Beautiful, yes, but eye-wateringly expensive. Silk was a precious commodity, its production a laborious secret in itself. Using it for everyday jottings would be like using $100 bills to wipe up a coffee spill. Effective, perhaps, but not exactly economical. Wooden tablets were also in use. Cheaper than silk, but still clunky and limited in space. You can almost feel the splinters under your fingertips. The awkwardness of trying to compose anything lengthy. Across the globe, other civilizations faced similar challenges. The Egyptians had their papyrus, crafted from reeds along the Nile, a marvel for its time but prone to cracking in dry climates and becoming a soggy mess in damp ones. Not to mention, the individual sheets had to be glued together, creating joins that could be rather annoying for a scribe trying to maintain a smooth flow. Further west in time, Europe would rely on parchment and vellum, made from animal skins. Durable, certainly, but requiring a rather involved and, shall we say, fragrant process of preparation, not to mention a significant number of deceased sheep or calves for a single substantial book. The world, and particularly a burgeoning empire like Han China with its increasingly complex bureaucracy and flourishing intellectual life, was crying out for something better. The sheer weight of administration, the need to record laws, census data, scholarly works, and imperial edicts was becoming, well, heavy. There's a limit to how many bamboo carts one can employ before the Imperial Logistics Department simply throws up its hands in despair. Imagine the Imperial suggestion box before paper. More chisels, please, and perhaps stronger carts for the archives. This pressing need for a lighter, cheaper, more practical writing surface was palpable. Enter, onto the stage of history, a figure shrouded in both renown and some scholarly debate, Kai Lun. Our mainstream historical fact for tonight is that Kai Lun, a eunuch official serving in the imperial court of Emperor He during the Han Dynasty, is traditionally credited with the invention of paper, or at least with formally presenting a refined method of papermaking to the emperor in the year 105 CE. Picture him, a courtier navigating the intricate politics of the palace, yet also possessing a keen, innovative mind. He wasn't just some palace functionary. He was in charge of manufacturing weapons and other implements. So he had a practical, hands-on understanding of materials and processes. Now, here's where it gets a bit more nuanced. Historians still argue whether Kai Lun was the absolute inventor of paper from scratch, or if he was more of a brilliant refiner and promoter of earlier, more primitive papermaking techniques that might have been bubbling up among the common folk for some time. Archaeological finds of very old paper fragments, some dating back possibly 2 centuries before Kai Lun's official announcement, suggest that proto-paper, perhaps made from hemp, was already in existence. But Kai Lun's process was the one that got the imperial stamp of approval, the one that was standardized and deemed worthy of wider, albeit still controlled, dissemination. So, how did they do it? Let's imagine you're peeking into Kai Lun's imperial workshop. The air is damp, filled with the earthy smell of wet fibers and the rhythmic thudding of mallets. The key ingredients were readily available and often recycled materials, which is a rather lovely touch of ancient sustainability. Think mulberry bark, scraps of hemp, old rags, yes, literally bits of discarded clothing, and even tattered fishing nets. This is our quirky tidbit for the evening. Some of the earliest Chinese paper might well have been made from the remnants of a fisherman's livelihood or a farmer's well-worn tunic, meaning ancient wisdom could literally have been recorded on someone's old pants. These raw materials were first soaked, then boiled or steamed to break them down, then pounded into a wet, sloshy pulp. You can almost hear the squelch and see the fibers separating, becoming a soupy, unpromising mush. This pulp was then poured onto a flat, stretched screen, often made of woven cloth or fine bamboo strips, held within a wooden frame. The craftsman would skillfully dip this frame into a vat of the fibrous slurry, slosh it gently to ensure an even coating, and then lift it out, letting the water drain through the mesh. What remained on the screen was a thin, matted layer of intertwined fibers. These wet sheets were then carefully pressed to squeeze out more water, sometimes stacked with weights on top, before being peeled off and dried, often on smooth, heated walls or hung up in the sun. The result? A sheet of paper, perhaps not the smooth, brilliant white stuff you're used to. Early paper would have been somewhat coarse, varying in thickness and color depending on the ingredients and the skill of the maker. It might have been a pale beige, a creamy yellow, or a rougher, darker hue. It wouldn't have been perfectly uniform, but compared to a heavy bamboo slip or an extravagantly priced roll of silk, it was a miracle. Suddenly, information had a lighter, more versatile vehicle. Record-keeping became more efficient. Literature could be copied and disseminated with greater ease, at least within the circles that had access to this new technology. Artists found a new surface for their delicate brushwork. While it didn't instantly transform China overnight, and certainly didn't immediately leapfrog its borders, this innovation laid a crucial foundation. The seeds of a revolution in communication had been sown, even if they were to take an astonishingly long time to fully sprout and spread across the globe. This wasn't exactly archival quality yet. Mind you, and you wouldn't want your critical tax records to dissolve in a damp cellar, but it was a monumental step forward. The journey of this humble material had begun, right there in the heart of Han Dynasty China. So, you have this fantastic new invention, lighter than bamboo, cheaper than silk, and capable of soaking up ink like a dream. What's the first thing you do? Naturally, you try to keep it all to yourself. Remember those heavy bamboo bundles we talked about in the Han scriptorium? The ability to replace those with lightweight paper gave any administration a colossal advantage. And the Han Dynasty, followed by subsequent Chinese dynasties, understood this perfectly. This wasn't just about easier note-taking, it was about state power, efficiency, and maintaining a sophisticated bureaucratic empire that was, in many ways, centuries ahead of its time. Therefore, early papermaking became a prized technology, its production methods and skilled artisans largely confined to imperial workshops. Sharing the recipe for paper back then was probably like sharing your top-secret government clearance today. a serious offense, likely met with more than just a disapproving glance. The initial spread, even within China, was deliberately slow and controlled. You didn't just pop down to the local market and pick up a ream of the latest Imperial Mulberry blend. For a good while, paper was primarily for official government use. Think endless scrolls of census data, tax records meticulously kept, laws and edicts copied and dispatched to far-flung provinces, and scholars in imperial academies penning histories and philosophical treatises under official sanction. Our mainstream historical fact here is that for several centuries, after its acknowledged refinement by Cai papermaking remained largely a state-controlled industry in China. Access was a privilege, a mark of status and connection to the imperial center. Getting your hands on paper was like trying to get early access to the latest, unreleased tech gadget. Only the VIPs, the high-ranking officials, and their closest associates got in on the first batches. The technology gradually seeped outwards from the capital, first to provincial administrative centers, and then, slowly, to monasteries and wealthy scholarly families. Historians still debate the exact mechanisms and stringency of China's control over early papermaking technology. Was it through explicit imperial edicts forbidding the export of knowledge, much like the fiercely guarded secrets of silk production? Or was it more of a practical monopoly, where the specialized skills, equipment, and access to certain raw materials were simply concentrated in imperial hands and closely knit guilds of artisans? It's likely a combination of both. You can imagine the workshops, perhaps in secluded compounds, where artisans pledged to secrecy toiled away. The knowledge was passed from master to apprentice, a precious oral tradition supplementing any written notes which would, of course, be on paper they made themselves. There was also the simple economic advantage. Why give away a technology that made your administration smoother, your record-keeping more efficient, and your scholars more prolific than anyone else's? This desire to control the technology wasn't just about being stingy with a good idea. It was a strategic asset. Consider the sheer administrative reach it afforded. While other empires were still chiseling on stone or struggling with brittle papyrus, China could manage its vast territories with a comparatively nimble flow of information. This bureaucratic efficiency, fueled by paper, was a cornerstone of its enduring strength and cultural cohesion for centuries, and it wasn't just for dry administrative texts. As paper became slightly more available and it began to fuel a vibrant literary and artistic culture, poems, calligraphy, paintings, all found a new, more accessible canvas. For a quirky tidbit, consider that early on, before it became widespread enough for common writing, high-quality paper was sometimes used as a luxurious wrapping material for delicate or precious items, like bronze mirrors or valuable medicines. It was also used for making intricate paper cuts, an art form that continues to this day. Imagine the antechamber of a wealthy official, perhaps a finely crafted bronze mirror, a gift for the emperor, being carefully wrapped not in coarse cloth but in sheets of this new, smooth, and still rather exotic material. Its very use as a wrapper signaled the value of the item within, and the sophistication of the giver. You wouldn't wrap your leftover dumplings in imperial-grade paper, that's for sure. Perhaps you might try to impress a potential suitor not with fragrant blossoms, but with a pristine, unblemished sheet of the finest imperial paper. For you, my dear, a surface upon which to pen your undoubtedly brilliant thoughts. A bit of a stretch, maybe, but it underscores how precious this new material was. The slow internal diffusion meant that even within China's borders, the transition from bamboo and silk to paper took centuries. Old habits die hard, and existing archives of bamboo strips weren't just going to be transcribed overnight. Plus, the initial quality of paper, while revolutionary, still had its issues. It could be susceptible to insects or damp if not stored properly. But the advantages were too compelling to ignore. As the techniques improved and production scaled up, however slowly, paper began its inexorable march to become the dominant medium, first within the halls of power, and then, ever so gradually, into wider society. The secret was potent, and China held it close, a silent advantage in a world still wrestling with stone and skin. Even the best kept secrets have a way of eventually, shall we say, leaking. And in the case of Chinese paper, the primary conduit for these initial tentative leaks was that legendary network of trade routes you know as the Silk Road. Picture it not a single paved highway, but a sprawling, shifting web of trails, oases, and bustling caravan cities stretching thousands of miles from the heart of China westward towards Central Asia, India, and eventually the Mediterranean world. For centuries, silk was the star of this show, its shimmering threads captivating distant empires and bringing immense wealth back to China. But nestled amongst the bolts of precious fabric, the spices, the jade, and the tea, another far more unassuming commodity began its slow journey rolls of paper. You're now a merchant, perhaps a Sogdian or a Persian, your camels laden with goods, navigating the treacherous passes of the Pamir Mountains or the searing expanse of the Taklamakan Desert. In a bustling Dunhuang market, or perhaps further west in Samarkand, you encounter Chinese traders. Amongst their wares, you might see these curious, lightweight sheets. Initially, you might not even recognize their primary purpose. Perhaps you see them used for wrapping delicate items, or for some strange, beautiful calligraphy you can't read. But gradually, the utility of this material for writing would become apparent, especially when compared to the parchment or papyrus you might be more familiar with. Our mainstream historical fact here is that the Silk Road was instrumental in the initial, slow diffusion of paper from China into Central Asia. It wasn't an organized technology transfer, not yet, but rather the movement of the finished product itself. Imagine the scene: a trader in a far-flung oasis city, perhaps Turfan, unrolls a sheet of Chinese paper. It's smoother, more flexible than the stiff parchment he's used to. It takes ink beautifully. He might use it to keep his accounts, to write a letter back home, or to copy a fragment of a Buddhist sutra. The people who encountered it would have been intrigued. This Chinese parchment, as some might have initially termed it, was a novelty, and like many novelties, it was probably expensive at first, a luxury item for the wealthy or the learned. Its arrival in new lands was less a flood and more a trickle. Think of it like the first appearance of a new smartphone model in a region where everyone is still using older flip phones. Exciting for a few, but not immediately adopted by the masses. The journey itself was arduous. Weeks, months, even years on the road. Paper, though lighter than bamboo, still had to survive the elements. Scorching sun, freezing nights, dampness, dust storms. You can almost feel the grit between the pages of a scroll that has made such a journey. Smell the faint aroma of campfire smoke or exotic spices that has permeated its fibers. The very fact that paper survived these transcontinental treks is a testament to its increasing quality and durability. This wasn't the rough, uneven stuff of the very earliest experiments anymore. Chinese papermakers had been refining their craft for centuries. One quirky tidbit is the discovery of ancient paper scraps along these Silk Road routes, some of them remarkably well preserved by the arid desert climates. For example, the Dunhuang manuscripts, a treasure trove of documents discovered in the Mogao caves, include not just Buddhist texts but also everyday documents, contracts, calendars, even a child's writing primer on paper dating from the 5th to the 11th centuries. Some of these were written on paper that had been recycled, with writing on one side and accounts or doodles on the other, an ancient form of scrap paper. It gives us a wonderfully intimate glimpse into the lives of people who were among the first outside of China to use this material. You can almost picture a monk diligently copying a sacred text, pausing to stretch. The only sounds the whisper of his brush on the paper and the distant howl of the desert wind. Historians still argue about the precise volume and impact of this early paper trade. Was it a significant flow, or just a sporadic curiosity? The evidence suggests a gradual increase in its presence in Central Asian oasis towns, particularly those with strong Buddhist monastic communities, as paper was an ideal medium for copying and disseminating scriptures. Buddhist monks, dedicated to scholarship and the spread of their faith, became key early adopters and transmitters of paper use. They needed a practical way to reproduce lengthy texts, and paper was far superior to palm leaves, which were common in India, or the bulky wooden slips still used in some regions. It's a bit like how early tech adopters often cluster in specific communities. Think of programmers and gamers being the first to embrace new hardware. For the Buddhist monks, paper was a killer app for religious dissemination. The whispers of paper were carried on the desert winds, in the saddlebags of merchants, and in the satchels of wandering monks. The West, however, remained largely oblivious for now. Rome was crumbling, and Europe was entering what's often called the Dark Ages, a period not exactly characterized by voluminous literary output or sophisticated bureaucratic needs that would drive demand for a new writing material. The initial journey of paper was eastward and southward from its Chinese heartland, and westward into the vibrant cultures of Central Asia. Its arrival was quiet, almost stealthy, but it was planting seeds. The world hadn't yet grasped the full potential of what those Chinese artisans, centuries before, had brought forth. But the rustle of those first sheets, carried along the Silk Road, was the sound of a slow, inevitable revolution beginning to stir. The idea of a cheap, versatile writing surface was too good to remain confined forever. While paper was making its slow, dusty trek westward along the Silk Road, its journey eastward and into neighboring lands was, perhaps predictably, a bit quicker and more direct. You can imagine China as a kind of cultural sun, radiating its innovations and its closest neighbors. Korea and Japan were well positioned to catch those early rays, including the warm glow of paper-making technology. Unlike the almost accidental seepage along the trade routes to the West, the transmission to Korea and Japan had a more focused, almost deliberate quality, often intertwined with the spread of Buddhism and the exchange of scholarly knowledge. You're now on a ship, a sturdy wooden vessel navigating the choppy waters of the Yellow Sea or the Sea of Japan. Perhaps you're a Korean envoy returning from a diplomatic mission to the Chinese capital, or a Buddhist monk seeking new scriptures and deeper understanding. Tucked away in your luggage, alongside scrolls of texts and perhaps some fine Chinese crafts, are examples of Chinese paper, and, crucially, maybe even a craftsman or two who holds the secrets to its production. Our mainstream historical fact is that paper-making technology is believed to have reached Korea from China by the 4th or 5th century CE, and then subsequently traveled from Korea to Japan, traditionally credited to a Korean Buddhist monk named Damjing Donsho in Japanese who arrived in Japan in 610 CE. Think of it for these kingdoms, culturally and often politically linked to the great Chinese Empire. Adopting Chinese innovations was a way to advance their own societies, and paper, with its obvious benefits for administration, scholarship, and religious practice, was a prime candidate. Once the know-how arrived, both Korea and Japan didn't just passively copy Chinese methods, they embraced the technology and began to adapt it to their own specific needs and available resources. You can almost feel the excitement in a Korean royal workshop or a Japanese monastic scriptorium as they first successfully produce their own sheets. It's like getting the source code for an amazing new program, and then being able to tweak it and add your own features. The Koreans, for instance, became renowned for their high-quality paper, known as hanji. They developed unique techniques, often using the fibers of the native paper mulberry tree, daknamu. Daknamu, along with other plants like bamboo and rice straw, they perfected methods of laminating thin sheets together to create incredibly durable and versatile paper, sometimes even oiling it to make it waterproof. You might see Korean scholars writing with elegant brushstrokes on this smooth, resilient hanji, or artists using it for vibrant paintings. It was used for official documents, books, and even for covering doors and windows, providing a translucent light. much like the shoji screens of Japan. It was said that Korean paper could last 1,000 years, a testament to the skill of its makers. No wonder they were proud of it. It wasn't just paper, and it was a national craft. Then, picture Damjing arriving in Japan, bringing with him not just Buddhist teachings, but also the knowledge of making paper and ink. This is a pivotal moment. Japan, then under the influence of figures like Prince Shotoku, was actively importing and adapting continental culture. Paper was a perfect fit for a society that highly valued calligraphy and was rapidly absorbing Buddhist texts. The Japanese, with their characteristic ingenuity and aesthetic sensibility, quickly made papermaking their own, developing what we now know as washi. They explored different fibers, such as kozo paper mulberry, mitsumata, and gompi, each lending unique qualities to the finished product: strength, translucency, a particular texture. Imagine the almost meditative process, the careful preparation of fibers, the rhythmic dipping of the suceda, a flexible screen into the vat of pulp, the gentle rocking motion to interlock the fibers, creating sheets of ethereal beauty and remarkable strength. A quirky tidbit is that in both Korea and Japan, paper wasn't just a utilitarian object, it became deeply integrated into the culture and even spiritual practices. In Japan, for example, washi has been used for centuries in Shinto rituals, for origami, though the intricate recreational folding came much later, for lanterns, umbrellas, and those iconic sliding doors, shoji, which diffuse light so beautifully. You can almost sense the respect given to a well-made sheet of washi. The understanding that it's a product of natural materials and painstaking human effort. It's not just a blank surface, it embodies a certain spirit. This is a far cry from just something to write on. It's like comparing a mass-produced plastic cup to a hand-thrown ceramic bowl. Historians still argue about the precise timelines and the exact routes of transmission, especially regarding the very earliest phases. For instance, while Damjing's role in bringing papermaking to Japan in 610 CE is widely cited, some scholars suggest that paper, or at least knowledge of it, might have arrived even earlier through less formal channels or other Korean missions. These debates often hinge on interpretations of ancient chronicles and archaeological fragments, but the broader picture is clear. Korea acted as a crucial bridge, absorbing Chinese technology and then passing it on, often with its own refinements, to Japan. This East Asian triangle of innovation, China inventing, Korea refining and transmitting, Japan adapting and aestheticizing, created a vibrant papermaking tradition long before the West had even heard a whisper of this remarkable material. It was a regional success story, a testament to cultural exchange and the power of a good idea to find fertile ground. The gentle rustle of hanji and washi would become the soundtrack to centuries of art, literature, and daily life in these kingdoms, a quiet testament to their quick and skillful embrace of Kai Lun's legacy. All right, so paper is flourishing in East Asia, a well-established craft in China, Korea, and Japan. But what about its journey westward, beyond those initial Silk Road whispers we talked about? For centuries, the vast deserts and mountains of Central Asia acted as a kind of permeable barrier. The product, paper itself, was trickling through, carried by merchants and monks. But the technology, the actual know-how of how to make it, that was still largely an Eastern secret. That is until a rather famous, or perhaps infamous, military encounter that many historians point to as a key turning point, the Battle of Talas River in 751 CE. You find yourself now in the midst of a geopolitical struggle. The powerful Tang Dynasty of China, at the peak of its expansionist ambitions, is pushing westward into Central Asia. At the same time, the newly risen Abbasid Caliphate, the dominant force in the Islamic world, is expanding eastward. Their spheres of influence are about to collide. The flashpoint is the Talas River, located in modern-day Kyrgyzstan. Here, the armies of the Tang, under General Gao Xianzhi, who was ethnically Korean. Interestingly enough, clashed with the Abbasid forces, who were allied with local Tibetan and Karluk Turkic tribes. Our mainstream historical fact is that the Battle of Talas in 751 CE resulted in a decisive victory for the Abbasid Caliphate and effectively halted the westward expansion of the Tang dynasty into Central Asia. But what does a battle have to do with paper? Well, as the story goes, among the prisoners of war taken by the victorious Abbasid forces were a number of Chinese artisans, including, crucially, some skilled papermakers. Instead of just being put to menial labor, these craftsmen were supposedly brought to Samarkand, a major city in what is now Uzbekistan, and, under duress or perhaps in exchange for better treatment, were compelled to teach their captors the art of papermaking. Imagine these Chinese craftsmen, far from home, their army defeated, now faced with a choice: share their valuable knowledge or face an uncertain fate. It's a dramatic, almost cinematic moment. You can picture them, perhaps with some reluctance, demonstrating the intricate process. The selection of fibers, linen, and flax were readily available in Central Asia, replacing the bamboo and mulberry bark of China, the pulping, the screening, the drying, to their new Arab masters. This is the traditional narrative, and it's a compelling one. Samarkand quickly became the first major center of paper production outside of East Asia, and from there, the technology began to spread throughout the Islamic world. It's like a single spark landing in a very dry, very receptive forest. However, like many neat historical narratives, there's some scholarly debate here. Historians still argue whether the Battle of Talas was the sole or even the primary mechanism for the transfer of papermaking technology. Some suggest that paper, and perhaps even rudimentary papermaking knowledge, might have already been seeping into Central Asia more gradually through those existing trade and cultural contacts along the Silk Road. Perhaps Chinese artisans had settled in some of these oasis towns earlier, or Sogdian merchants. Those intrepid middlemen of the Silk Road had already pieced together some of the secrets. The battle, in this view, might have accelerated a process already underway, or perhaps provided a critical mass of skilled artisans in one place. Rather than being the single eureka moment of technology transfer, regardless of the exact aha moment, the impact was undeniable. Central Asia, with its established trade routes and vibrant intellectual culture, was primed for this new technology. The introduction of local materials like flax and linen, instead of Chinese mulberry or bamboo, was a key adaptation. Think of it as regional cuisine. The basic recipe for paper came from China, but the local chef's Central Asian artisans started using readily available local ingredients, giving it a distinct new flavor and making it much easier to produce on a larger scale. Our quirky tidbit relates to the very prisoners who allegedly spilled the beans. There's no detailed historical record naming these specific papermakers or their individual stories, which adds to the legend. They are the unsung, involuntary heroes of paper's westward journey. Imagine the irony: these men, participants in a failed military campaign, ended up unleashing a technological force that would profoundly shape the culture of their conquerors and, eventually, the entire Western world. Their names are lost to history, but their enforced knowledge sharing had consequences far beyond what anyone at that dusty battle could have foreseen. It's a classic case of unintended consequences. You go to war expecting to gain territory, and you end up with the recipe for a global communication revolution. Oops, we lost the battle, but hey, at least they now know how to make really good stationery. It probably wasn't the official report back to the Tang Emperor. The establishment of papermaking in Samarkand was the crucial bridge. Before this, the Islamic world, like Europe, had relied primarily on papyrus, especially in Egypt and the Levant, and parchment. Papyrus was becoming scarcer as the Abbasids lost direct control over Egypt for periods, and parchment, as we know, was expensive and labor-intensive. Paper, once the technology was established, offered a far more economical and practical alternative. The stage was now set for paper to move from being a Central Asian specialty to becoming the very fabric of the intellectual and administrative life of the burgeoning Islamic Golden Age. The slow crawl across the desert was about to turn into a much faster gallop. From Samarkand, that initial spark of paper-making knowledge, whether forcibly extracted after Talas or gradually acquired, ignited a veritable wildfire across the Islamic world. You're now witnessing one of the most enthusiastic and transformative adoptions of a new technology in history. The period from roughly the 8th to the 13th centuries is often referred to as the Islamic Golden Age, a time of extraordinary scientific, philosophical, literary, and artistic flourishing. And paper, my friends, was the unsung hero, the very substrate upon which much of this golden age was written. Imagine trying to fuel a renaissance of learning using only clunky clay tablets or pricey parchment. It just wouldn't have the same get up and go. The Abbasid Caliphate, with its capital in Baghdad, became the epicenter of this new paper-fueled intellectual ferment. Our mainstream historical fact is that the first paper mill in the Islamic world was established in Baghdad, likely in the late 8th century, not long after the Battle of Talas. Some sources say it was founded by Al-Fadl ibn Yahya, one of the Barmakid vizier's chief ministers to Caliph Harun al-Rashid, a name you might recognize from the 1001 Nights. This wasn't just a small workshop, it was a significant state-sponsored enterprise. The Caliphate quickly recognized the immense administrative and cultural advantages of this new material. You can picture Harun al-Rashid himself, a figure of legendary wealth and power, perhaps examining some of the first sheets produced in his capital. Realizing that this flimsy material was, in its own way, as valuable as gold for running an empire and fostering a vibrant culture. From Baghdad, the technology spread like news of free falafel. Paper mills sprang up in cities across the Islamic world: Damascus, Cairo, Fez, Cordoba. It's like a new, incredibly popular coffee shop chain opening branches everywhere. Suddenly, you have access to a relatively cheap, versatile, and readily available writing material. What does this do? It democratizes knowledge, and to an extent, books, which were once rare and incredibly expensive luxury items when scribed on parchment, could now be produced in far greater numbers and at a lower cost. Libraries, like the famed House of Wisdom Beit al-Hikmah in Baghdad, swelled with an unprecedented volume of texts, translations of Greek philosophy, Indian mathematics, Persian literature, alongside original Arabic works on medicine, astronomy, algebra, and poetry. You can almost smell the scent of thousands of paper scrolls and codices, hear the rustle of pages as scholars from diverse backgrounds pore over them, debating, discussing, and adding to the sum of human knowledge. The impact on administration was equally profound. Remember how the Han Chinese valued paper for bureaucracy? The Abbasids were no different. Vast amounts of government records, tax rolls, legal documents, and official correspondence could now be managed with greater efficiency. Paper was lighter to transport, easier to store, and quicker to write on than parchment. This administrative lubrication helped to hold together a sprawling empire that stretched from Spain to the borders of India. You can imagine a busy government office in Baghdad, scribes furiously penning documents on stacks of freshly made paper, the air buzzing with the quiet efficiency that this new material enabled. No more waiting for weeks for a single parchment document to be prepared. Paper was ready to go. One quirky tidbit is that the shift from parchment to paper in the Islamic world wasn't just about cost and convenience. It also had an interesting side effect on forgery. Parchment could be scraped clean and reused, which, while economical, also made it easier for sneaky individuals to alter documents. Paper, especially the early Islamic varieties, was much harder to erase without leaving obvious telltale signs of tampering. The fibers would get roughed up. The ink would bleed differently. This inherent security feature was apparently quite valued. So, in a way, paper was the original tamper-evident packaging for important information. It's like today's holographic seals on banknotes, but made of mashed-up flax and rags. Try to change this tax demand. Buddy, the finance minister might have chuckled. This new paper will show your every nefarious scrawl Historians still argue about the speed and completeness of the transition from papyrus and parchment to paper in different parts of the Islamic world. While Baghdad and the eastern regions adopted paper relatively quickly and enthusiastically, in other areas, particularly Egypt with its long tradition of papyrus production, the change might have been more gradual. Papyrus continued to be used for some purposes for several centuries, and parchment retained its prestige for high-status documents like luxury copies of the Quran for a while. It wasn't an overnight switch everywhere. Think of it like the transition from vinyl records to digital music. Some people clung to the old format for its familiar qualities or specific uses, even as the new one became dominant. But the overall trend was clear: paper was winning. It was fueling a knowledge explosion. Scholars could afford to have personal libraries. Students could make their own copies of texts. New literary genres flourished. The relative cheapness of paper even facilitated the keeping of more ephemeral records. Personal letters and notes, giving us richer insights into the daily lives of people from that era. This wasn't just a technological shift, it was a cultural one. The very availability of paper changed how people interacted with information, how they learned, and how they governed. The Islamic Golden Age didn't just happen on paper. In many ways, it happened because of paper. The legacy of those Chinese prisoners of war, or perhaps those anonymous Silk Road traders, was now blooming spectacularly in the heartlands of Islam. The embrace of paper in the Islamic world wasn't just a passive adoption of Chinese technology, it was a springboard for innovation. Once the basic techniques were mastered, artisans and scholars in cities like Baghdad, Damascus, and later across North Africa and Spain began to experiment, refine, and elevate papermaking to a sophisticated craft. You're no longer just looking at functional but perhaps somewhat coarse sheets. You're starting to see paper with a wider range of qualities, colors, and finishes, tailored for diverse and increasingly specialized uses. This is where paper truly comes into its own as a versatile medium. Imagine yourself in a bustling Baghdad paper souk, a marketplace filled with the scent of drying pulp, sizing agents, and perhaps the faint aroma of dyes. Stacks of paper of varying hues and textures are on display. Some are thick and sturdy, perfect for book covers or official documents that needed to last. Others are thin and almost translucent, ideal for tracing or for delicate calligraphy. This wasn't a one-size-fits-all situation anymore. Our mainstream historical fact here is that Islamic papermakers introduced several key innovations, including the use of trip hammers powered by watermills to mechanize the laborious pulping process. This was a significant step up from the manual pounding with mallets that was common in earlier Chinese methods or even the initial Central Asian production. Picture a water wheel turning rhythmically, powering heavy wooden hammers that rise and fall, mashing the raw fibers, linen, flax, hemp, rags, into a uniform pulp much more efficiently. This mechanization allowed for larger-scale production and often a finer, more consistent pulp, leading to better quality paper. It's like going from hand-grinding your coffee beans to using an electric burr grinder. The output is more consistent, and you can make a lot more out a lot faster. But it wasn't just about mass production. Islamic artisans were also pioneers in the finishing and treatment of paper. They developed methods for sizing the paper, treating its surface to reduce its absorbency, making it smoother and preventing ink from feathering or bleeding. This was crucial for the elegant Arabic calligraphy that was so highly prized. Common sizing agents included starch, often derived from wheat or rice. You can almost feel the difference. An unsized sheet might feel a bit like blotting paper, soaking up ink too readily, while a sized sheet offers a smooth, almost slick surface for the reed pen, the kalam, to glide across. They also experimented with polishing the paper, perhaps with smooth stones or shells, to give it a luxurious sheen, making it even more desirable for high-quality books and important documents. Furthermore, the Islamic world saw the widespread production of colored papers. While the Chinese had experimented with dyes, Islamic papermakers turned it into a common practice. You might find paper in shades of blue from indigo, yellow from saffron or turmeric, red from madder or insect-based dyes like kermes, and even black. These colored papers weren't just for show, they served practical purposes. Different colors could be used to categorize documents, for specific sections of a book, or for particular literary genres. And, of course, they added to the aesthetic appeal. Imagine a beautifully calligraphed Quran with chapter headings on rich blue paper, or a collection of poetry where each section is introduced on a different pastel shade. It's like the difference between a black and white movie and one filmed in glorious Technicolor. Our quirky tidbit for this section is the possible early development of something akin to watermarks in an Islamic paper. While true, translucent watermarks as we know them, formed by a raised design on the papermaking screen, are more commonly associated with later European papermaking. There's evidence that some Islamic papermakers used subtle techniques to mark their products or indicate quality, perhaps through specific patterns in the laid lines of the screen, or by impressing a design onto the damp sheet. Historians still debate the extent and nature of these early proto-watermarks or maker's marks in Islamic paper. It's not quite the clear image of a fleur-de-lis you might see in an old European book, but rather more subtle variations that a connoisseur might recognize. Imagine a master papermaker in Damascus having a particular way of finishing his screens that left an almost imperceptible pattern, a kind of silent signature on his work, saying, "This is a genuine sheet from my workshop. None of that cheap knockoff stuff from down the street." These advancements weren't happening in a vacuum. They were driven by the immense demand for paper from scholars, scribes, merchants, and administrators. The culture of bookmaking and collecting was incredibly strong. Libraries weren't just repositories, they were active centers of learning and copying. Calligraphers were highly respected artists. Bookbinders developed sophisticated techniques, creating beautiful leather-bound volumes with tooled designs. Paper was at the heart of this entire ecosystem of knowledge. You can picture a scholar commissioning a copy of a rare text. He wouldn't just want any paper. He'd specify the quality, perhaps the color for certain sections, ensuring that the physical object was worthy of the knowledge it contained. The innovations weren't limited to the paper itself. The use of paper also spurred advancements in inks, pens, and bookbinding. The entire infrastructure of creating and using written materials was evolving rapidly. This period saw the refinement of recipes for stable, black carbon inks and vibrant colored inks. The qalam, the traditional reed pen, was perfected for writing on paper's smooth surface. It was a holistic improvement. So, when paper eventually makes its way to Europe, it won't be the rudimentary Chinese invention. It will be a far more sophisticated product, having benefited from centuries of refinement and innovation in the vibrant intellectual centers of the Islamic world. It was, in essence, Paper 2.0 ready for its next great leap. So, paper is having a grand old time in the Islamic world, fueling scholarship, art, and administration with its versatile charm. But what about Europe west of the vibrant Islamic caliphates? The vast Christian territories were, for a long time, largely oblivious or indifferent to this papery revolution happening just across the Mediterranean or over the Pyrenees. The journey of paper into Europe was much like its initial creep out of China, a surprisingly slow and hesitant affair, with one of the earliest, yet still sluggish, points of contact being the Byzantine Empire. You find yourself now in Constantinople, the magnificent capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, or Byzantium. It's a city of dazzling mosaics, immense churches like the Hagia Sophia, and a deeply ingrained imperial bureaucracy that had inherited Roman traditions. For centuries, Byzantium had thrived using papyrus, imported primarily from Egypt, and parchment, which was locally produced and highly valued for important documents and luxurious manuscripts. Our mainstream historical fact is that paper, known in Byzantine Greek as Bagdadikos, literally from Baghdad, or Bambikion, possibly referring to the Syrian city of Manbij Hierapolis, a known paper production or trading center, began to appear in the Byzantine Empire from around the 8th or 9th century. primarily through trade with the Islamic world. However, its reception was, shall we say, lukewarm. You can picture a Byzantine scribe, accustomed to the familiar feel of parchment or the texture of papyrus, being presented with this new material from the Saracens. He might have found it flimsy, perhaps less durable, or simply too foreign. There was a strong conservatism in Byzantine scriptoria. Parchment, in particular, had an aura of prestige and permanence. It was the traditional material for sacred texts and imperial decrees. Switching to this new, cheaper material from a rival civilization wasn't an easy sell. It's like trying to convince a dedicated vinyl collector that streaming is just as good. There's a certain resistance to change, a fondness for the familiar. Paper did find some uses. Of course, its lower cost made it attractive for more ephemeral records, private letters, or preliminary drafts. You might see merchants in Constantinople using it for their accounts, or scholars making personal copies of texts. But for official imperial documents or high-quality illuminated manuscripts, parchment remained the king for a very long time. The Byzantine chanceries, the official writing offices of the empire, were particularly slow to adopt paper for their most important pronouncements. Imagine an imperial official, resplendent in his silk robes, dictating a decree. The idea of it being recorded on anything less than the finest vellum would have been almost unthinkable for many years. What is the Baghdad stuff? He might sniff. Bring me proper skin. Historians still debate the exact reasons for Byzantium's slow embrace of paper. Was it purely cultural conservatism and a preference for traditional materials? Was it related to the quality of the early paper reaching them, which might not have always been top-notch compared to the best parchment? Or were there economic factors at play? Perhaps related to the control of trade routes or the existing infrastructure for parchment production? It's likely a combination of these factors. The Byzantines had a well-established system for producing and using parchment, and the supply of papyrus from Egypt, while sometimes disrupted by political turmoil, was a known quantity for centuries. Paper was the new kid on the block, and it had to prove itself. One quirky tidbit is that despite the official coolness, there's evidence of a kind of paper trail of personal correspondence and less formal documents showing its gradual infiltration. For instance, some of the personal letters of Byzantine scholars and officials from the 11th and 12th centuries have survived on paper. These documents give us a glimpse into its everyday use, even if it wasn't gracing the most solemn imperial charters. You can picture a scholar, late at night, illuminated by an oil lamp, hastily penning a letter to a colleague on a sheet of this more affordable paper, discussing theological points or complaining about the price of wine. It was useful, just not yet fully respectable in the highest echelons. The famous, or infamous, Fourth Crusade in 1204, which saw Western European crusaders sack Constantinople, had a devastating impact on the Byzantine Empire and its cultural treasures, including its libraries. Ironically, while this event marked a decline for Byzantium, the increased contact and subsequent Venetian dominance in parts of the former empire may have indirectly helped to familiarize Western Europeans more with Eastern goods, including paper, though Italy was already getting its paper through other channels we'll explore soon. Byzantium's cautious, almost reluctant. Glance at paper as a fascinating case study in technological adoption. It wasn't enough for a new technology to be cheaper or more efficient in some ways. It also had to overcome existing traditions, vested interests, and cultural preferences. While the Islamic world had pounced on paper and made it its own, Byzantium mostly watched from the sidelines, dipping a toe in the water but never fully diving in during paper's most dynamic period of Islamic innovation. This slow dance meant that Byzantium didn't become a major center for paper production itself, relying instead on imports. It also meant that paper's journey further into the heart of Christian Europe would primarily come not through the grand eastern gateway of Constantinople, but through a different, more southerly route. One that was also, perhaps surprisingly, under Islamic influence. The paper tide was rising, but it was finding different channels to flow through. While Byzantium was cautiously eyeing paper from across the Bosphorus, a much more dynamic entry point for this revolutionary material into Europe was being established at the continent's other extremity, the Iberian Peninsula, or what you know as Spain and Portugal. For several centuries, much of this region, known as Al-Andalus, was under Islamic rule. And it was here that paper, now a well-established and sophisticated product of the Islamic world, first planted firm roots on European soil. You are now stepping into the vibrant, multicultural cities of Al-Andalus, Cordoba, Seville, Granada, and later, Zadova. These weren't sleepy backwaters. They were dazzling centers of learning, art, and commerce, rivaling Baghdad and Cairo in their brilliance. Our mainstream historical fact is that papermaking was introduced to Islamic Spain by the Moors as early as the 10th century, with the first recorded paper mill in Europe being established in Zativa Jatava, near Valencia, around the year 1056 CE, or perhaps even earlier by some accounts. This wasn't just a small workshop. Zativa became a major center for paper production, renowned for its quality. Imagine the bustling activity, the rhythmic clang of water-powered trip hammers beating flax and linen pulp, the primary raw materials in Spain. As in much of the Islamic world, the sight of workers skillfully dipping their screens, and the acres of paper drying in the Mediterranean sun. This wasn't paper being imported as a finished luxury good anymore. This was Europe learning to make its own, thanks to the knowledge carried by Islamic artisans and entrepreneurs. The contrast with Byzantium's hesitant adoption is stark. In Al-Andalus, paper was an integral part of a flourishing intellectual and administrative culture. Libraries, like the legendary one in Cordoba under Caliph Al-Hakam II, were said to house hundreds of thousands of volumes, an astonishing number for the time, and utterly unthinkable without paper. Scholars, poets, philosophers, and scientists, Muslim, Jewish, and even some Christian Mazarabs living under Islamic rule, all benefited from the ready availability of this relatively inexpensive writing material. You can picture students in Cordoba, a city famed for its universities and public baths, easily obtaining paper to copy text and take notes. A far cry from the expensive parchment that would have been the norm in Christian kingdoms to the north. It's like the difference between having readily available, cheap notebooks versus having to do all your homework on hand-engraved silver plates. The paper produced in Zativa and other Andalusian centers was of high quality, often made from linen and hemp, and it began to be traded not only within Al-Andalus but also gradually into the Christian kingdoms of northern Spain and even further afield into southern France and Italy. This was a slow but steady diffusion, driven by the practical advantages of paper, merchants keeping accounts, monasteries needing to copy texts, royal chanceries drafting documents. All could benefit. However, just like in Byzantium, there was some initial resistance or suspicion in Christian Europe. Paper was sometimes seen as a Jewish or Saracen invention, lacking the prestige and perceived durability of parchment. Some early European documents written on paper even have apologetic notes from the scribe, almost justifying why they weren't using traditional animal skin. Forgive the humble paper, your grace, but parchment was dear and the news urgent. One can almost hear them say. One quirky tidbit is related to the town of Zadova itself. Its name became so synonymous with paper in some parts of Europe that early forms of the word for paper in some Romance languages might have been related to Zatova or its variants. While the more common etymological root for paper is, of course, papyrus, the local fame of Zativa's product certainly left its mark. Imagine being a trader in Toulouse or Genoa in the 12th century, asking for some of that good Sativa stuff when you needed writing material. It's like asking for Swiss chocolate or French wine. The place name becomes a hallmark of quality or origin. Historians still debate the exact impact of the Reconquista, the centuries-long process by which the Christian kingdoms of northern Spain gradually reconquered Al-Andalus on the paper industry. As Christian rulers took over cities like Toledo, Zaragoza, and eventually Zativa itself, which fell to James the Foreign of Aragon in 1248. Did they actively suppress the existing papermaking industry, or did they recognize its value and allow it to continue? Perhaps under new management, the evidence suggests that while there were certainly disruptions and shifts in population, the utility of paper was too great to simply abandon. Papermaking continued in these regions, even under Christian rule. Although the main centers of innovation in European papermaking would soon shift eastward to Italy, the legacy of Islamic Spain as Europe's paper gateway is undeniable. It was through the bustling cities and learned courts of Al-Andalus that the continent first encountered not just imported paper, but the actual technology of its manufacture. While the cultural transfer was complex and often fraught with conflict, this particular piece of knowledge was a game changer. Those rhythmic sounds from the mills of Zativa were like a quiet drumbeat, heralding a profound shift in how Europeans would record, transmit, and eventually massively multiply their knowledge. The slow journey of paper from China had found a crucial entry point, and from here, it would begin its much more rapid conquest of a continent on the cusp of its own intellectual and cultural awakenings. While Spain, through its Islamic connections, was an early European adopter and producer of paper, the real explosion of papermaking in Christian Europe, the place where it truly took off and became a major industry, was Italy. You find yourself now in the bustling city-states of late medieval Italy, Genoa, Venice, Florence, and, crucially for our story, a smaller town in the Marche region called Fabriano. By the late 13th century, Italy had become the leading paper manufacturer in Europe, and its product was considered the best available. This wasn't just about copying existing methods. Italian artisans brought their own ingenuity and commercial drive to the craft, revolutionizing it in ways that would pave the way for its widespread use across the continent. Our mainstream historical fact is that the town of Fabriano, Italy, became one of the most important and innovative centers of papermaking in Europe. With its mills well established by the 1270s, Fabriano isn't on a major river like the Arno or the Po, but it had clear spring water, essential for producing clean, white paper. And it was in a region with a strong tradition of wool processing, which meant a ready supply of linen and cotton rags, the primary raw materials for European paper at this time. You can picture the scene: numerous watermills along the local streams, not grinding grain, but powering those heavy trip hammers, tirelessly macerating rags into a fine pulp. The air would be filled with the thrum of machinery and the scent of damp fibers. Fabriano's papermakers were not just producing, they were innovating. What set Italian, and particularly Fabriano, paper apart? Several key advancements. Firstly, they improved the pulping process, using more efficient water-powered stampers with multiple heads, sometimes shod with metal, to break down the rags more effectively and create a smoother, more uniform pulp than had often been achieved before. They also refined the sizing process. While Islamic papermakers used starch, the Italians pioneered the use of animal gelatin, made from boiling down scraps of animal hides and bones. This gelatin size created a harder, less absorbent surface that was particularly well suited for writing with quill pens, which were the standard writing implement in Europe. The ink sat crisply on the surface rather than sinking in. You can almost feel the smooth, almost crisp texture of a high-quality Fabriano sheet, perfect for the sharp nib of a goose quill. This was a significant improvement, making the paper more durable and resistant to ink feathering. Trying to write on poorly sized paper with a quill would be like trying to paint a watercolor on a paper towel. A frustrating, blurry mess. Perhaps the most famous Italian innovation, and our quirky tidbit for this section, was the development and widespread adoption of the watermark. While, as we mentioned, there might have been proto-watermarks in some Islamic papers, the Italians perfected the technique. A watermark is created by incorporating a bent wire design into the mesh of the papermaking mold. This wire creates a slight thinning in the sheet of paper. So, when you hold the dried sheet up to the light, The design appears as a translucent image. Fabriano papermakers were using watermarks by around 1282. These weren't just decorative, they served as maker's marks, indicating the mill or artisan who produced the paper, and also as a guarantee of quality and even sheet size. Imagine a merchant buying a stack of paper. He could hold it up to the light and see the familiar insignia of a trusted Fabriano mill, a bull's head, a crossbow, a mermaid, or a pair of scissors, and know he was getting the good stuff. It was an early form of branding and quality control, like a copyrighted logo embedded directly in the product. Look for the prancing unicorn. Accept no substitutes. However, despite these improvements and the growing availability of Italian paper, its acceptance across Europe wasn't immediate or universal. There was still considerable resistance, particularly from official chanceries and monastic scriptoria, where parchment held sway. Parchment was seen as more durable, more prestigious, and, importantly, it was a known quantity. Paper was still viewed with suspicion by some. There are even edicts from the period restricting the use of paper for certain official documents. For example, Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, in a decree from 1231, though this was before Fabriano's peak, it reflects an earlier sentiment, ordered that official documents written on paper should be transcribed onto parchment for longevity. Historians still argue about the primary drivers of this resistance. Was it purely a concern for durability? A kind of material snobbery? Or perhaps even pressure from the established parchment-making guilds who saw their livelihood threatened? This flimsy new rag stuff will never last. They might have grumbled. Stick to good old sheepskin. It's seen empires rise and fall. Gradually, though, the advantages of paper, its lower cost, its smoother surface thanks to gelatin sizing, and its increasing quality began to win out. Italian merchants, with their extensive trading networks reaching across Europe, were key to its dissemination. Bales of Fabriano paper, and paper from other Italian centers like Amalfi and Padua, found their way to France, Germany, the Low Countries, and even England. The rise of universities across Europe in the 12th and 13th centuries also created a growing demand for a cheaper writing material for students and scholars. While luxury books might still be commissioned on vellum, everyday study and note-taking became much more feasible with paper. The Italian paper-making revolution was a crucial turning point. They didn't just adopt an Eastern technology, they adapted it, improved it significantly, and industrialized it on a scale not seen before in Europe. They effectively Europeanized paper, making it suitable for European writing tools and European needs. Those watermarks, those subtle images hidden within the fabric of the sheet, were not just symbols of a mill. They were symbols of a craft perfected, ready to support the explosion of knowledge and communication that was just around the corner with the Renaissance and the invention of the printing press. The stage was meticulously being set, one watermarked sheet at a time. With Italy, particularly Fabriano, now churning out high-quality, watermarked paper. The next phase of our story sees this remarkable material beginning its slow, sometimes hesitant, crawl northward into the rest of Europe. You're no longer just in sun-drenched Italy. You're venturing into the cooler, often damper, climes of France, Germany, and the Low Countries. The journey wasn't always a swift or enthusiastic embrace. Much like a new fashion trend that starts in Milan and takes a while to reach Paris and then Berlin, paper had to overcome local traditions, economic factors, and a fair bit of ingrained skepticism. Imagine a bustling medieval trade fair in Champagne, France, or a Hanseatic League port city like Bruges or Hamburg. Amongst the bales of wool, casks of wine, and stacks of timber, you'd start to see Italian merchants hawking their paper. Initially, it would have been an imported luxury, perhaps more expensive than locally produced parchment in some areas, or at least comparable enough that the switch wasn't a no-brainer. Our mainstream historical fact is that while paper use began to spread into France and Germany from the early 14th century, largely imported from Italy, The establishment of local paper mills in these regions came significantly later. France saw its first documented paper mills around the mid-14th century of GG near Troy, while Germany's first known mill, established by Ullmann Stromer in Nuremberg, dates to 1390. That's over a century after Fabriano was already a major production hub. So, why the lag? You can picture a French royal scribe or a German monastery abbot examining a sheet of Italian paper. It's smooth. It's relatively cheap, but it's new. And it's made of rags. Parchment, on the other hand, made from the skins of their own local sheep and calves, felt more substantial, more traditional. There was a certain gravitas to a hefty parchment document that flimsy paper, at first, couldn't quite match. Remember Emperor Frederick II's decree about transferring paper documents to parchment? That kind of sentiment lingered. It wasn't just material preference, it was also about existing industries. Parchment production was a well-established craft, with its own guilds and supply chains. These groups wouldn't have been thrilled about a cheaper competitor muscling in. Bah, this papier de chiffre, this rag paper. A French parchment maker might exclaim, "It's fit for wrapping fish, not for the king's laws." The technology transfer itself also took time. Setting up a paper mill wasn't a simple affair. You needed a good source of clean water, lots of it. A steady supply of linen and cotton rags, which weren't always abundant, leading to rag shortages at times, and crucially skilled artisans who knew the secrets of pulping, sheet forming, sizing, and drying. These weren't skills you could just pick up from a manual, assuming manuals were even readily available or that people could read them. Knowledge often traveled with migrating craftsmen. Perhaps an Italian papermaker, seeking new opportunities or fleeing turmoil at home, would set up shop north of the Alps, bringing his expertise with him. Ullmann Stromer, for instance, famously brought in Italian papermakers to get his Nuremberg mill operational. He even had to promise them exclusivity and guard them closely, as if they were rock stars with a secret formula. A quirky tidbit from this period concerns the collection of those essential rags. As demand for paper grew, rags became a surprisingly valuable commodity. Rag pickers, often poor people scouring city streets and dumps for discarded linen and cotton textiles, played a vital, if unglamorous, role in the paper industry. There were even rag wars and official ordinances in some towns regulating the collection and sale of rags to ensure local mills had enough raw material. Imagine towns appointing official rag procurement officers whose sole job was to ensure a steady stream of old shirts and undergarments for the local mill. "Your old smock for a brighter tomorrow," written on, of course, could have been their motto. Historians still argue about the precise economic and social factors that eventually tilted the balance in favor of paper in Northern Europe. Was it the Black Death in the mid-14th century, which, by drastically reducing the population, paradoxically increased per capita wealth for some survivors and also disrupted traditional labor-intensive industries like parchment making, making paper a more attractive alternative? Or was it the gradual rise of literacy and the expansion of universities and commerce, creating an ever-increasing demand that parchment simply couldn't meet affordably? It was likely a complex interplay of these elements. As bureaucracy grew in the emerging nation-states, and as merchants needed to keep more detailed records, the sheer volume of writing required began to make paper's cost-effectiveness irresistible. The quality of locally produced paper in France and Germany also gradually improved. Inspired by and sometimes competing with Italian imports, they adapted techniques to their local conditions, found suitable water sources, and developed their own watermarks. Regions like the Auvergne in France became known for their paper production. You can start to see a shift. A scholar in Paris or a merchant in Frankfurt might still prefer Italian paper if he could get it and afford it. But good quality local alternatives were becoming increasingly available. The northward creep of paper was less a triumphant march and more a slow, steady infiltration, winning converts one letter, one scholarly treatise at a time. It was laying the groundwork, almost invisibly, for the information explosion that was to come. The printing press was still a few decades away, but when it arrived, it would find a continent increasingly supplied with the one thing it would need, above all else, plenty of affordable paper. As paper solidified its presence across continental Europe, with mills humming in Italy, France, and Germany, one might expect England, just a short hop across the channel, to have been an early and enthusiastic adopter. Yet, rather curiously, England was something of a latecomer to the paper-making party. While imported paper, primarily from Italy and France, had been used in England for centuries, the establishment of a successful, lasting paper industry on English soil took a surprisingly long time. You're now crossing the English Channel, perhaps with a cargo of French paper, wondering why this bustling trading nation was slow on the uptake for local production. Our mainstream historical fact is that while there were a few early, often short-lived attempts to establish paper mills in England, John Tate is credited with the first mill near Hartford around 1490, but it didn't last long. The English paper industry only began to flourish significantly in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, spurred on by, among other things, an influx of skilled Huguenot refugees from France who brought their paper-making expertise with them. Before this, England was largely reliant on continental imports for its paper supply. You can picture English merchants and scholars in the time of Chaucer, or even the early Tudors, writing on sheets that had made the journey from Fabriano, Troyes, or perhaps even further afield. Another shipment of Genoa fine has arrived. Lads, a stationer in London might announce, much to the relief of scribes running low on their preferred continental stock. So, what caused this English tardiness? It wasn't that the English weren't using paper. They were, and in increasing quantities, for government records, legal documents, merchant accounts, and the burgeoning literary scene. But producing it locally seemed to be a hurdle. Historians still debate the primary reasons for England's slow start in papermaking. Several factors likely played a role. Firstly, England had a very well-established and high-quality parchment industry. English parchment, particularly from sheepskin, was renowned for its quality and was deeply entrenched in legal and official use. The Inns of Court, the monasteries, and the royal chancery were all major consumers of parchment, and the guilds controlling its production were powerful. Why fix what ain't broke? Especially when the fix comes from foreign lands and is made of old clothes. Secondly, there might have been a lack of readily available, suitable raw materials in the early days, or perhaps a lack of the specific technical skills needed for consistent, high-quality production. Papermaking, as we've seen, requires not just rags and water, but also considerable know-how in pulping, forming sheets, and especially in sizing for use with quill pens. Early English attempts might have struggled with quality control. Imagine an early English papermaker, full of enthusiasm but perhaps lacking the finesse of his Italian or French counterparts, producing sheets that were too coarse, too absorbent, or too brittle. Right, a frustrated scribe might say, back to the trusty sheepskin. This English stuff just isn't up to snuff. Thirdly, economic factors and England's strong trade links with the continent might have made importing paper relatively easy and cost-effective, reducing the immediate incentive to invest heavily in domestic production until demand reached a critical mass or import supplies were disrupted. If you can get good quality paper reliably from your French or Italian trading partners, why go through the trouble and expense of setting up your own, potentially risky, mills? It's the classic make-or-buy decision. Our quirky tidbit for this section is related to one of those early pioneers, John Tate. His paper mill, established near Hartford around 1490, did produce paper, some of which was used by Wynkyn de Worde, the successor to William Caxton, England's first printer. Tate even had his own watermark, an 8-pointed star and a double circle. However, his venture was not commercially successful in the long run and folded after a few years. It's a reminder that innovation and entrepreneurship don't always lead to instant success. Poor John Tate, ahead of his time. Perhaps, or just unable to compete with the established continental suppliers and the enduring preference for parchment. He was like an indie app developer trying to compete with Microsoft in the 90s. A valiant effort, but a tough market. The turning point for English papermaking often cited is the arrival of skilled Protestant Huguenot refugees, fleeing persecution in France, especially after the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in 1572, and later following the revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685. These weren't just any immigrants. Many were highly skilled artisans, including papermakers, who brought their advanced techniques and trade secrets with them. They settled in various parts of England and helped to establish and improve the quality of English paper mills. It's a classic story of how immigration can vitalize an industry. Suddenly, England had access to a pool of expertise that it previously lacked. Mills like those established by John Spillman or Spielmann, a German-born jeweler who set up a paper mill in Dartford, Kent, in the 1580s and was granted a patent by Queen Elizabeth then, began to produce paper of a much higher quality, capable of competing with imports. Spillman, in fact, was even granted a monopoly on the collection of rags for papermaking for a time. So, while England might have been fashionably late to the papermaking scene, it eventually caught up, driven by rising demand, the expertise of immigrant craftsmen, and a growing desire for national self-sufficiency in this increasingly vital commodity. The stage was being set for paper to play its crucial role in the England of Shakespeare, the King James Bible, and the burgeoning scientific revolution. The rustle of English-made paper would soon become a familiar sound in the halls of power, the print shops, and the studies of its great writers and thinkers. By the mid-15th century, paper, made from linen and cotton rags, sized with gelatin, and often bearing the subtle imprint of a watermark, had become a familiar, if not yet universally dominant, writing material across much of Western Europe. Italy was the powerhouse. France and Germany were increasingly self-sufficient, and even England was starting to get its domestic act together. The slow, centuries-long journey from Han Dynasty China was approaching a pivotal moment. Paper was ready for its close-up, ready for a technology that would unleash its full potential and create an almost insatiable hunger for its smooth, receptive surface. You were now standing on the cusp of a revolution, in a workshop in Mainz, Germany, around the year 1450. The air smells of ink, metal, and the faint, sweet scent of damp paper. In this workshop, a man named Johannes Gutenberg is tinkering with a rather extraordinary invention movable type, and the screw press. Our mainstream historical fact is that Gutenberg's development of a commercially viable printing press with movable metal type in the 1450s is widely considered a watershed moment in human history, marking the beginning of the mass production of books and the rapid dissemination of information. And what was the essential fuel for Gutenberg's hungry presses? Paper, mountains of it. Parchment. While it was used for some early, very special edition printed books like a few copies of the Gutenberg Bible, was far too expensive and its supply too limited to support printing on a large scale. Imagine trying to print 1,000 copies of a book on sheepskin. You'd need a flock the size of a small county, and the cost would be astronomical. Paper was the only viable option. Suddenly, the demand for paper, which had been growing steadily with the rise of universities, commerce, and bureaucracy, exploded. It was like going from a gentle garden hose to a fire hydrant. Gutenberg's invention, and its rapid adoption and improvement by printers across Europe, meant that books, pamphlets, flyers, and all sorts of printed matter could be produced in unprecedented quantities, at speeds and costs previously unimaginable. You can almost hear the rhythmic clank and squeak of those early wooden presses, each impression transferring ink from type to paper, creating another page, another copy, and each one of those pages needed to be a sheet of paper. The papermakers, who had been gradually increasing their output for centuries, now found themselves facing a demand curve that went almost vertical. More paper became the cry from the print shops. We need it smoother, we need it faster, we need it cheaper. This sudden, intense demand had several effects on the paper industry. Firstly, it spurred a rapid expansion of paper mills across Europe. Countries and regions that had only a few mills saw new ones spring up wherever there was a good water source and a supply of rags. Papermaking, once a somewhat niche craft, became a strategic industry. Secondly, it put immense pressure on the supply of raw materials, namely those linen and cotton rags. Remember our rag pickers and rag wars? They became even more intense. Governments passed laws restricting the export of rags, and there were constant efforts to find new sources or even alternative fibers, though success with alternatives to rags would have to wait a few more centuries. It's a bit like the lithium rush today for batteries. Everyone suddenly needed this one crucial ingredient. One quirky tidbit from this era highlights the intimate connection between the old and the new. Some of the earliest printed books were produced on paper that still bore the watermarks of the Italian, French, or German mills that had been operating for decades. When you examine an incunable book printed before 1501, the watermark can often tell you where and roughly when the paper was made, providing clues about trade routes and the paper supply for early printers. Imagine Gutenberg himself, or his financial backer Johann Fust, carefully selecting batches of paper, holding them up to the light to check the watermark, a reassuring sign of quality from a trusted mill like Fabriano, or perhaps a newer German supplier. He'd be looking for sheets that were strong enough to withstand the pressure of the press, smooth enough to take the ink evenly, and consistent in their thickness. This batch with the dancing bear watermark looks good. Heinrich? Order another 1,000 sheets. Historians still argue about the precise speed at which printing spread and its immediate impact on literacy rates. While the potential for mass communication was unleashed, it took time for books to become truly cheap and for literacy to become widespread. However, and there's no doubt that printing dramatically accelerated the circulation of ideas. Religious treatises think of the Protestant Reformation, which was hugely facilitated by printed pamphlets and Bibles, scientific discoveries, classical texts rediscovered during the Renaissance, and new literary works. And every single one of these was printed on paper. Paper became the vehicle for the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the scientific revolution. It carried the arguments of Luther, the anatomy of Vesalius, and the plays of Shakespeare, though he came a bit later, in the full bloom of the print era to an ever wider audience. The relationship between paper and print was symbiotic. The printing press needed paper, and the availability of relatively cheap paper made the printing press viable. Together, they transformed the intellectual landscape of Europe and, eventually, the world. The slow journey of paper, from its guarded origins in China, through the scholarly centers of the Islamic world, and into the burgeoning mills of Italy and Northern Europe, had reached a critical juncture. It was no longer just a convenient writing material. It was now the essential medium for a new age of mass communication. The quiet rustle of a single sheet had become the roar of the presses, a sound that would echo through the centuries, changing societies in ways Kai Lun could never have dreamed. With paper firmly established as the indispensable partner to the printing press in Europe, its journey was far from over. The age of exploration, kicking off in the late 15th century and continuing for centuries, saw European ships venturing across the vast oceans, discovering new continents, and establishing colonies. And wherever these explorers, conquerors, missionaries, and settlers went, they took paper with them. You're now on a creaking wooden galleon, smelling of salt, tar, and damp. Perhaps with Columbus, Cortez, or Cartier, and in the captain's cabin, or among the priest's effects, are logbooks, charts, letters, and Bibles, all made of paper. This humble material was about to find new lands, new uses, and eventually new sources for its own creation. Our mainstream historical fact is that paper-making technology was introduced to the Americas by the Spanish in the 16th century. The first paper mill in the New World is generally believed to have been established in Culhuacan, near Mexico City around 1575 or 1580. This wasn't for printing Shakespearean sonnets just yet. It was primarily to meet the administrative and religious needs of the burgeoning Spanish colonial empire. Imagine the Viceroy of New Spain needing to send dispatches back to Madrid, or Franciscan friars wanting to print catechisms in indigenous languages. Importing all the necessary paper from Europe was expensive and slow. Setting up a local mill, using local labor often indigenous and adapting to local conditions, made practical sense. Gentlemen, the Viceroy might declare, we cannot govern this vast territory effectively if we have to wait 6 months for a shipment of writing material from Seville. Find me some local rags and someone who remembers how those mills in Zadova worked. The early paper mills in the Americas faced unique challenges. The traditional European raw material, linen and cotton rags, wasn't always readily available in the same quantities as in the rag-rich cities of Europe. This led to experimentation with new, local fiber sources. While these early attempts weren't always successful or sustainable for high-quality paper, suitable for printing, they marked the beginning of a long search for alternatives to rags. A search that would eventually revolutionize papermaking in the 19th century with the advent of wood pulp. You can picture early colonial papermakers, perhaps with a mixture of hope and frustration, trying to mash up agave fibers, yucca leaves, or other unfamiliar plants, hoping to create a usable pulp. This stuff smells weird, and the paper keeps falling apart. But maybe if we pound it longer? This brings us to a quirky tidbit long before Europeans arrived with their rag-based paper. Some indigenous cultures in Mesoamerica, notably the Maya and the Aztecs, had their own form of paper-like writing material. The Aztecs, for example, made amatl from the inner bark of fig trees genus Ficus. The bark was soaked, beaten with stone tools until the fibers matted together, and then smoothed and dried into sheets. A model was used for codices, screen-fold books to record genealogies, tribute lists, astronomical observations, and religious rituals. When the Spanish arrived, they were often suspicious of these native books, viewing them as repositories of pagan knowledge, and many were destroyed. However, the tradition of amatl making survived in some indigenous communities and has seen a revival in modern times for crafts and artwork. So, while Kailan's paper was new to the Americas, the concept of a processed plant fiber writing surface wasn't entirely alien in some parts of the continent. Imagine a Spanish friar showing a sheet of European paper to an Aztec scribe, who might have thought, thinner than my amatl and whiter, but I see the principle. Historians still argue about the extent to which indigenous knowledge might have subtly influenced or been ignored by early colonial papermakers. While the European rag-based technology was dominant, there might have been local awareness of fiber processing that could have, in theory, contributed. However, the colonial mindset often prioritized European methods. The main story of paper in the Americas for the first few centuries was the transplantation of European techniques and the struggle to find adequate raw materials. As European settlements grew in North America, paper mills were gradually established there as well. William Rittenhouse, an immigrant from Germany, established the first paper mill in the English colonies near Philadelphia in 1690. Like in Mexico, these early North American mills faced a chronic shortage of rags, leading to constant appeals in newspapers for citizens to save their old linen and cotton. Benjamin Franklin, himself a printer, was keenly aware of the importance of a domestic paper supply and was involved in promoting paper mills. The journey of paper to new continents mirrored the complexities of colonialism itself. It was a tool of administration and evangelization, helping to impose new systems of governance and belief. But it also became a tool for colonial dissent, for the printing of pamphlets and newspapers that would eventually fuel independence movements. Think of the Declaration of Independence or the revolutionary tracts of Simón Bolívar, all disseminated on paper, some of it perhaps even produced in the very colonies striving for freedom. The quest for new fiber sources, driven by the chronic rag shortages in both Europe and the Americas, would eventually lead to the great breakthrough of using wood pulp in the mid-19th century. But for now, in the 16th, 17th, and early 18th centuries, paper in the New World was still largely the rag-based child of its Chinese ancestor, adapting to new environments, serving new masters, and slowly, painstakingly, finding ways to be made from the unfamiliar flora of these new lands. The journey was becoming truly global, and the demand was only set to grow. And so, our surprisingly slow yet utterly transformative journey of paper has brought us from the workshops of Han Dynasty China, across the deserts of the Silk Road, through the vibrant intellectual centers of the Islamic world, into the burgeoning mills of medieval and Renaissance Europe, and finally, across the vast oceans to the shores of the Americas. It's been a journey of millennia, a relay race of innovation and adaptation, where each culture that embraced paper added its own unique touch, its own refinements, before passing the torch, or rather, the pulp. You've seen it evolve from a closely guarded imperial secret to the very fabric of global communication, a silent witness and an active participant in the rise and fall of empires, the birth of new ideas, and the spread of knowledge across continents. As we stand now, looking back from our modern vantage point, surrounded by a digital world that once threatened to make paper obsolete, it's clear that this ancient material still holds a profound significance. Our mainstream historical fact for this final leg of our journey is that despite the rise of digital technologies, global paper consumption, while perhaps plateauing or declining in some specific sectors like newsprint, remains incredibly high overall, particularly for packaging, tissue, and specialty papers. The paperless office that was predicted with such confidence in the late 20th century remains, for many, as elusive as a perfectly calm inbox. We still print, we still write, we still wrap, and we still use paper for very personal hygiene. It seems old habits, especially ones that are so deeply woven into the fabric of our civilization, die very hard indeed. The 19th century, as we briefly touched upon, brought the most significant change to paper production since Kai Lun's era, the invention of methods to produce paper from wood pulp. Pioneered by figures like Friedrich Gottlob Keller in Germany and Hugh Burgess and Charles Watt in England. This innovation finally solved the chronic rag shortage that had plagued papermakers for centuries. Suddenly, with vast forests available, paper could be produced on an industrial scale never before imagined. This led to the age of cheap, mass-market newspapers, penny dreadfuls, and affordable books for an increasingly literate populace. You can almost smell the piney scent of those early wood pulp mills, a stark contrast to the musty odor of old rags. This also meant, however, that much of the paper produced from the late 19th century onwards was highly acidic and prone to yellowing and crumbling, a conservator's nightmare we're still dealing with in our libraries and archives. The quest for cheapness came at a cost to longevity, a far cry from that durable Korean hanji or a fine Fabriano sheet. One final quirky tidbit for our journey: consider the sheer variety of things paper has been used for beyond just writing and printing. We mentioned early Chinese uses for wrapping or even clothing. Over the centuries, paper has been used to make furniture, building materials like papier-mâché or reinforced paper tubes, currency a hugely important one, tea bags, coffee filters, sandpaper, electrical insulation, and even, in wartime, things like disposable fuel tanks for aircraft. Its versatility, stemming from its simple fibrous nature, is truly astounding. It's the chameleon of materials, able to be strong and rigid, or soft and absorbent, depending on how it's treated. Imagine someone from Kai Lun's time being shown a modern supermarket with its aisles upon aisles of paper-based packaging. Their mind would be well and truly boggled. All this, from mere plant fibers and old cloth. Historians still argue about the future of paper in an increasingly digital age. Will its role continue to diminish, relegated to nostalgic uses and niche applications, or will it find new purposes, new forms, perhaps even new sustainable production methods that address environmental concerns about deforestation and chemical use in pulping? The debate is ongoing, but paper has proven itself to be remarkably resilient. It has a tactile quality, a permanence when made well, and a simplicity that digital media often lack. There's a certain authority to a signed paper document, a certain intimacy to a handwritten letter on good stationery, a certain pleasure in the feel and smell of a well-made book that pixels on a screen can't quite replicate. Is this the final chapter for paper, you might wonder? Or just another turn of the page? As we draw this long narrative to a close, think of that initial spark in a Han Dynasty workshop. It was a simple idea to create a better surface for human thought. That idea, embodied in the humble sheet of paper, has journeyed through vastly different cultures, navigated complex trade routes, fueled intellectual golden ages, and powered revolutions in communication. It has been a quiet enabler, a backstage workhorse, yet its impact is immeasurable. It carries our laws, our literature, our science, our art, our histories, and our most intimate correspondences. The journey was indeed surprisingly slow, often taking centuries to cross geographical or cultural boundaries. But each step, each adaptation, each new mill built, and each new use found added to its momentum, until it became the ubiquitous, indispensable material that, even now, shapes so much of our world. And now, as the night deepens around you, and the soft hum of your fan perhaps lulls you towards slumber, let the story of paper gently settle in your mind. Consider the incredible winding path it took to reach your hands, whether in the form of a book beside your bed, a note on your desk, or even the very device upon which you might be experiencing this story. This humble invention, born of necessity and ingenuity, has connected minds across vast stretches of time and space. Its legacy is not just in the grand libraries or the pivotal treaties, but in every simple list, every hastily scribbled idea, every carefully crafted letter that has ever been committed to its patient surface. The world you know, the knowledge you possess, the very way you think, has been profoundly shaped by this slow, tenacious traveler. Let its quiet persistence be a soothing thought as you drift off. May your dreams be light and your rest peaceful, knowing that even the simplest things can have the most extraordinary stories.